Hey everyone, and welcome to another informal Q&A video. This time around I got 3 questions from you guys, all of them having to do with Fire Emblem Engage, and so I figured it would be most appropriate to have in the background some footage of what me playing Engage has been looking like, at least since the last DLC dropped, so the last month or so that I've been playing on and off. You may notice that it gets a little repetitive, grindy, but that plays into what we're going to be talking about today, or some of it anyway, so it is appropriate in that sense. Anyway, let's get right into the first question. If you haven't watched one of these before, I'll put them up on screen as I read them, and then just answer them in sequence like that. Any plans to do a 100% guide for Engage like you did for Three Houses? Quick answer, no. And longer answer would be, I have no desire to look into 100% for Engage in the same way that I did for Three Houses for a number of reasons. First off, and most importantly, that Engage is just not really built for the completionist mentality in the same way that FE16 was. And that may sound a little odd when you first think about it, because Engage has achievements, whereas Three Houses didn't, and it's also a single route, so you could, in theory, get, a perfect file, as opposed to Three Houses, where you have to play through many, many times to get everything. I mean, even if you're just doing the supports, that will take you probably around 10 to 12 playthroughs, depending on how many S ranks you can buy with Renown. But anyway, the problem with Engage 100% is twofold. One is that all of it is tied to the single save file. The supports, the achievements, none of that carries over there, and it's very strange not having a universal support log, among other things, but that's just something that we have to deal with here because IS didn't think that was important. And secondly, I'm kind of showing my roots here as a completionist in that I came into that mentality more from things like Zelda and collectathon platformers and not so much RPGs, because I tend to think of grinding as a poor form of 100% completion, or an uninteresting form. Like, it doesn't appeal to me, and unfortunately that is what Engage 100% mostly boils down to. You're going to be doing a lot of grinding, and that's one of the main reasons I wanted to show off just how much grinding behavior goes on into that. There's, you have to, the biggest one probably is bond fragments, because you have to do things like, to get all the achievements, you have to create 5,000 bond rings, which if you do the math, that's 5 million bond fragments on that alone. And then there's all the bond conversations. There's the support conversations grow very slowly in this game. They sped it up a little bit with one of the updates, but it's still pretty slow by modern FE standards. And then, there's just all sorts of things. There's even online content in the achievements that I haven't even touched yet, but I imagine that that's going to take a very long time when I finally do start getting into that. And it's just not very fun to me, especially like if you're actually watching what I'm doing here in the background. You'll notice that very little of my time is dedicated to actual Fire Emblem gameplay. I'm even auto-battling through it. And I've never used the auto-battle feature in any previous Fire Emblem, but you reach a point, at least in normal mode, when your stats are high enough, that you can kind of just auto-battle every time, every single turn, and short of the AI being stupid with Celica's Engage attack, you're very rarely going to have someone die, and if someone does, you can just, rewind out of it. And all the rest of the time that you're going to be spending doing it, it's supports, it's fishing. Oh my god, so much fishing. I hate fishing minigames. It's actually kind of funny. I was thinking of this today when I was thinking of this question. Does anyone actually like fishing minigames in any video game ever? Because I only ever see people complaining about them. If you like any fishing minigame from any video game, please let me know about it in the comments. I want to hear, because I just do not see what's appealing about it. Engage goes very hard in that life sim direction, even more so than Three Houses, because especially, like, a lot of things in Three Houses you can ignore as you're working towards 100%. Like, you can almost completely ignore the greenhouse, you can ignore fishing, and Engage, you do get to that point with some things, like the RNG for getting all the cooking achievements is horrible, but once you're done with it, you're done with it. And then things like polishing rings or the exercise minigame or the flying minigame, those you can kind of ignore once you've gotten everything out of them. It's just the fishing, because the fishing is unfortunately the best source of bond fragments late game, and there's no nuance or nothing interesting to it. It's just you go during the day, you cast in the middle and you have one of the second highest value fish is the bonus fish. Like 70-something% of the time, you will pull up a fish that's worth 1,000 bond fragments. Rinse and repeat 10 times between every battle, and you will. That's the most bond fragments you can get per run. And then of course you have to do things like making sure Sommie stays happy, because Sommie helps you with the fishing. And if you're also doing weapon forges, you need to make sure to have your dogs always getting ore for you, although I already got the achievements for those, so I'm not as concerned anymore with forging. You have to buy and sell a bunch of items. It's so pointless, especially and when gold can be so hard to come by. And I mean, I've gotten to the point where I'm ending up doing things like second sealing characters into their alternative classes just to have some kind of variety, because it's really boring, and just I end up skipping a lot of the supports. I may watch them later, but it's not fun at this point. And while there is a sense of achievement in getting the achievements, it's not the kind of 100% that it appeals to me. And so that's why, to finally return to the question and stop me complaining, I'm not doing 100% for Engage. I think it's just not well designed for that mentality, and that's fine, because Fire Emblem historically is not. Like most games, you're only looking at the support log, and in a lot of the older games, it is very annoying to fill out the support log. I'm thinking of the GBA games in particular, but also Awakening and Fates. Like if I had to rank the supports of FE in order of like most to least obnoxious, which I've actually thought about doing just as a fun video, oh my goodness, I don't have a lot of love for most of the 3DS games. I'm sorry in that regard. That's the reason why I'm not doing a guide for that. So anyway, let's move on to the second question, which is sort of related. With the official DLC already out for FE Engage, what would your dream DLC be for the game? Admittedly for myself, seeing shiny animated models of titular villains and maybe getting a boss map with them. Bonus that they were also ringified. That's an interesting suggestion. I know a lot of people were disappointed in the final map of Engage, where they have the bosses from previous games, but they're just like generic robed figures and they don't really even have any dialogue. So that would have been interesting. I'm not as in love with villains fulfilling that role, especially, I mean, if I wanted that, I could just go to Heroes, where pretty much all of them have a version or two. But I can see why that might be appealing. My dream DLC would be probably something to do, again, with the 100%, but it would be something like, not New Game Plus. I don't think Engage is built around New Game Plus. I think that's kind of just something that Koei Tecmo maybe threw in for Houses and Hopes, and it's not really normal in Fire Emblem otherwise. So I would probably say something like a post-game challenge that feels relevant, and it's not just like you're grinding out the same maps over and over, or maybe doing online. Something like Apotheosis from Awakening would be really interesting to have, because I know that map in particular in Awakening developed like its entire min-maxing metagame around it, and even though Engage doesn't have eugenics babies, thank God, it would be an interesting, like, ultimate challenge for the people who really want something like that. And I don't really play Fire Emblem for the difficulty, but I know that there's a certain appeal there. Some other way to farm bond fragments that is not fishing, pretty much for just what I ranted about for the last question. Something that is not so mind-numbing, I don't know, like an emblem ability that gets you bond fragments whenever you defeat enemies or something like that. Kind of like how Emblem Veronica has one that gives you SP. That would have been nice to have in one of the DLC emblems. It's kind of unfortunate that they didn't give you that. But it's just anything that's not fishing or something worse than fishing. Of course, I don't really foresee Engage getting any more DLC just because FE doesn't really tend to do multiple waves of DLC. I know some people are holding out hope next month for during the Nintendo Direct, and that's presumably going to happen in June. I think everyone talks about it as if it's guaranteed because it replaces what E3 used to be, but I don't know if it's 100% certain that we're getting a Direct next month. But anyway, I don't see them announcing any Engage DLC. I certainly don't see them announcing any Hopes DLC. I know there are like a handful of people still holding out hope, pun intended, for DLC for that game, but I just don't. A combination of the game not selling as well as they maybe thought it did, and IS seems to be moving on from Fodlan, at least in terms of it's now entered the canon of older FEs where it's being used for heroes a lot, of course, but not as often as it was. Like, I'm expecting we've just got a Three Houses banner in Heroes. I expect that that's going to be the only one we get this year. There were I think 3 years where there were 2 Three Houses banners in a year. I don't think we're going to get that again. I mean, New Heroes. Seasonal is different. So I don't see them announcing any kind of DLC for either of those games. I am holding out some expectation that there will be some kind of Fire Emblem announcement. I know everyone thinks FE4 Remake because it was in the same leak that correctly predicted Engage, but I will wait until I actually see evidence of an FE4 Remake before I get excited over it, because that is top of my list for Fire Emblem games I want to see remade, and people have been predicting it for years, and we've basically since Echoes came out, and we have seen nothing on it. I'm just going to wait and see. But yes, to get back to the question, that would be my dream DLC. Some kind of post-game challenge that actually feels meaningful, and a better way to farm bond fragments. Maybe a universal support log, but I feel like that's something they could add in a free update, and since they haven't done that yet, they're just not going to do it. That doesn't really feel like DLC material. That's just kind of quality of life in a very narrow sense. Only a few people seem to care about that. I realize that when I get people like asking me like, who did I marry my avatar to in any given FE, and they're like, and I'm, well, every single option, because of course I want those shiny green S rank letters to show up in the support log. That's what being a completionist is about, because you get to, that satisfaction. It's not about which of these characters I would want to date or marry in real life. I don't even think of them like that. I mean, I realize that there are a lot of people do, and that's the main appeal of avatars, but yeah, that's not for me. However, I do have one more question, and it's somewhat connected to that final sentiment, and it's a bit more positive in general. It's kind of a back and forth, but it's me not ragging on the gameplay of Engage anymore, because I realize a lot of this Q&A has been that, and I don't like being overly negative about things like that. It's just not as fun. I know negativity sells on the internet, but I try to rein it in. Please rank the Engage Royals from your most favorite to your least favorite. You don't have to hate your least favorite, just the one that speaks the least to you. I'm assuming for this question that we're only talking about the 8 human royals, and we're not counting any of the dragons, because that's usually what people mean when they say that. Like, I don't really have many strong opinions on Nell or, what's her brother's name? Neil, I'm blanking on his, Rafal, there we go. I don't have very strong opinions on them if I have trouble remembering their names. And that's not to say I hated Engage's DLC. I actually kind of like Nell as a character, but I'm going to leave those aside and just focus on the 8 royals. My number 1 pick might sound a little funny, but I think I'm going to go with Ivy. Ivy is, first of all, I like her design. I think she's fun in gameplay. Flying mages are always fun. I mean, there's a reason that Dark Flyers come back in almost every game. She's snarky, and I find that just kind of amusing. And although I don't think she quite reaches the same level of interesting complexity for me as Camilla does with regard to, like, concubine wars, there is some of that in the Illusian royal family, and I like the little bits of that we seem to get. And Ivy is a pretty interesting character all around. So yes, she would be my number one royal. Bearing in mind, though, that none of the engaged royals are really like top 10 characters for me in all of Fire Emblem, so that doesn't mean as much as maybe it sounds like. Like I already said that I prefer Camilla to Ivy. But just with these 8, second place would be Fogado. Now, if Fogado and Bune's ending had actually followed through on their support line, I would have ranked him first because I really enjoy their dynamic. Naturally, it's very similar to Demidu. And I just think Fogado is overall a very fun character. He doesn't get a lot of screen time in the plot, but, he's entertaining in his supports. And also, I think the DLC does a little bit more with him than maybe any of the other worlds. It kind of makes him more of a, actual repeating antagonist figure. I think you fight him 3 times, which is more than anybody else. And so that was kind of interesting, and I do feel like the localization probably toned down his more interesting edges, maybe more flirtatious edges, because I kind of get that impression from several of his supports, including the earlier ones, of course. But it would have been nice if that hadn't happened, but that's true of the entirety of the localization. And yeah, Fogado and Bune would have been great, but, we'll always have Demidu. So Fogado is my second place character. Third place, who's next? Saline, excuse me. Kind of similar to Ivy. At first you think she's just obsessed with tea, and she's kind of a Lissa analog, and her dress is absolutely ridiculous. But, the more you get into her harder edges, the more interesting she becomes, and I really like seeing that coming out of her supports. Just behind her would be Alfred. Alfred he's maybe not exactly designed to appeal to me, but I like that he does have kind of that sort of melancholy bittersweetness to him, which you don't really see in a lot of the other characters, particularly their endings. I know a lot of people hate that Alfred dies in his regular ending, but I think that's more in line with Fire Emblem endings than most of Engage's character endings. So that's nice to see, and it's just I think it's also nice that he is one of the more unambiguously romantic ones, so if you really want a gay option, Alfred is there, and he hasn't been neutered by the localization. Not really my type, but, if you're into blonde twinks, Alfred's pretty good there. So, let's see, we have 5th place, Diamond. Diamant deserves to be in the middle because he is so very bland. I wish he had something more to him, but he's just kind of a generic prince. He's only slightly more interesting than someone like Roy, and there's very little that you can say about Roy, and actually now that I'm thinking about it, Roy is the emblem that Diamant starts with, so maybe that's weirdly appropriate. But I feel like he could have had potential, particularly with some of his supports getting a little bit suggestive. But yeah, that's just not there, so you'd have to dip into headcanon, and he's just kind of a good prince turned good king, and not even the DLC does all that much with him. They just make him more uncertain of himself. 6th place, who we got left? Tamara. I don't have a lot to say about Tamara. I think her design is really fun. I like the nods to Carnival in Sommie. I know it's more Brazilian Carnival than Louisiana Carnival, but, Carnival traditions are, to some extent, universal. So I like that, that fun aspect of her. The meat thing is a little overdone, but I don't like that in Ike either. And hey, there's another pairing, because she's paired with Emblem Ike, so... they must have just been thinking of that. And her singing is awful, but I think that's the point. If you're into sapphic subtext, her relationship with Marin is very similar to Fogada's with Bune, including the fact that they kind of, they don't follow through at the very end, and their ending is not really satisfying at all. So that's unfortunate. But yeah, Tamara ranks 6th. 7th place, Alchrist. He's not the type of character I'm normally interested in, and I do find him kind of annoying at points. He does get over his more annoying qualities, but I just don't see that much to interest me about him. He's probably more entertaining in the DLC because he's like actually evil. Like he's I think he's planning to assassinate Diamond. I think that's mentioned somewhere, and really interesting to see that change. But regular Alchrist is just I'm not really into anxiety-riddled sad boys, as you might want to call him. And then last place is, of course, Hortensia. Now, Hortensia does have some interesting things going for her. I think, like, related to Ivy, she's got the whole concubine wars kind of imitating Noir. And I do think the way that the game handles her grief over her father's death is nuanced, and I like that about her. But the problem with Hortensia, and the reason I had to rank her last, is it's very similar to my feelings on Bernadetta. Their voices are so shrill and painful to listen to, and I realized that that was intentional, so I'm not knocking the voice actors for that, but it makes it very hard to get through a lot of the scenes that have those characters in them, because I cannot stand how grating their voices are. It's a sticking point because it's very noticeable in the very first cutscene with Hortensia. I think that's where she's at some of her worst in terms of really high-pitched, shrill voices. And I notice sometimes you see this on Twitter, mostly, that like people will say that if you like Alchrist but dislike Bernadetta, that means you're a misogynist. And my reaction to that is, well, I'm not a big fan of either character, and I have a more visceral reaction against Bernadetta primarily because of the voicing. Like, I would compare her to Hortensia more there, and like that's just, I guess, a sensory thing you would call it. Now, between the two, I would probably say I like Hortensia a little better, even so, because you hear the shrill voice less, kind of similar to Alchrist. It's not as prominent. But yeah, I had to rank Hortensia last, which is unfortunate because she is a fun character in gameplay for similar reasons to her sister. It's really hard to listen to her sometimes. But that's going to do it for this Q&A session, a little shorter than some of the other ones I've done, but I wanted to get this out just to keep up with you guys through the month of May, because I've got a lot of projects that I'm working on the side. I've got my Pride project that I intend to have out on June 1st, which I guess is going to become a tradition for me. It's going to be on Disco Elysium, which has been very interesting to write about. I am terrified that I'm not going to do that game justice, but I'm just going to do my best with what I have because it is quite the game. The rest of the stuff that I'm working on you may see on the Wicked Binge Network that I have been asked to collaborate on. The Octopath Traveler 2 one is already out, and there's a couple more in the works. So you may be seeing those throughout the month, but I'm going to be taking the next couple of weeks to work on all of that, as well as deal with some things in my own life offline. So I wanted to touch base with you guys. I have been very grateful for, all the support and the likes and subscriptions, I can't talk, that I've been getting lately. I'm now over 460, so I'm getting very close to 500. I teased this back at New Year's, but I teased it again in a community post, but if I get to 500, I'm going to be doing a video on 10 wanky fandom discourses in Fire Emblem throughout the years, because I think that would be a very interesting topic. It's something that a lot of EpiTubers don't really cover, because they tend to cover more things like in-game or things related to the gameplay and not so much the fandom. But I'm one of those people who thinks that fandom can often be as interesting, if not more so, than the media that it's built around. On the off chance that you listening to this and you're not subscribed, be sure to subscribe, because I'm getting closer to that goal, and then you can look forward to Fire Emblem Discourse story time. So that's going to do it for this video. Thank you all for watching. Like it, and if you enjoyed it, make sure to comment down below on your thoughts on these questions. I'd like to read them. And as mentioned, if you're not subscribed, please do so. But that's going to do it for me today. Au revoir.